Well, thanks, Corey, again for having me, and thanks to the church to having me back. I have given this talk before. I don't remember exactly how long it's been, but it's been a few years. And Corey said there'd been some new members that had not heard the talk, so thanks for having me back. This time, a little bit different. Usually I just get right into the talk, but this time I thought I would sort of give you a little history behind the talk and a little bit about me and sort of how I got to where I am. I grew up in Kentucky. As Corey said, my mom and dad, Dula and Helen Ashley, we all grew up in Kentucky. I was an only child, or still am an only child, as far as I know. And so I decided I wanted to go to medical school. But before that, as a young boy, I received Jesus as my Savior and never really looked back. Always accepted that and was very happy. And then as life would have it, I believe Jesus led me to go to medical school. I went there at the University of Kentucky, came here to Georgia. This is how I got in Georgia, was to actually study surgery, to come and do my surgery residency at the medical center. Left there, went on to Grady, where I did a trauma fellowship, which means I wanted to specialize in trauma surgery, not just general surgery. And then eventually went to Pittsburgh for a year and did critical care. So I set myself up for training to where I could take care of the most sick patients and the most critically injured patients. And now I've had about 20 years experience doing that. So about 10 years or so ago, I started reading some things about the crucifixion. And I'd always heard about the crucifixion, and even through my medical school and things, it didn't really dawn on me how daunting that was, or what the physiologic effects were, or how severe that was, because I'd always seen it portrayed in movies, and there's Jesus is hanging on the cross, and it didn't seem, it was bad, but it didn't seem quite that bad. It really didn't register. And then as I started doing a little research and looking into it, and then coupling that with all the patients that I'd seen and all the training that I'd had in physiology and anatomy, I started realizing, there's something I'm missing here. There's more to this story than just what I'm seeing on TV or just what I've seen, in church plays. And that was really sort of the genesis of this talk. And then I started hearing rumors about people, I forget what year it was, but many years ago, started saying, well, Jesus really wasn't dead when they put him in the tomb. They put him in a nice, cool tomb. And these were sophisticated people that were saying this. These were very educated doctors that were actually coming up with this theory. And they said he was just asleep. He was sort of knocked out. And when he got in the cool tomb, it revived him, and then he sort of escaped, and that's how this all happened. So I thought, that doesn't seem right. And as I started researching it, looking into it, it turns out that that's not really feasible. So I sort of put this talk together. I'm a believer, so that goes without saying, and I think probably most of you are here today. But I really put this talk together not so much for the believer, but for the unbeliever, to see if they have a question in their mind about Jesus, if they have a question in their mind about whether or not he was dead when he went into the tomb, then I really wanted to help answer some of those questions. And so that's really where we're going to go today. We're going to be very scientific. We're going to go through physiology. We're going to go through history, and we're going to see what happened, because I won't just use the Bible today. Some people may say, well, I don't believe the Bible. Well, okay, let's go outside the Bible. Let's go with Roman history. Let's go with things that we know about how the Romans crucified people. Let's go with medical knowledge, and let's see where we end up. And so through that journey, I will deal with some of the controversies that you may have heard. And at the end, I'll switch from a little bit of science, and I'll sort of give you my own personal belief. So these are all the sources that you see here that I'll be covering today. Two of which I would really point out. This book here by Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ. He was an atheist when he wrote that book, or when he started writing it. Very intelligent man. Used to write for the Chicago Tribune as an investigative type reporter. And once he got done investigating it, he gave his life to Jesus, because he said the evidence is just too strong. There's no other conclusion that I could have. So I would really recommend that book to you. And then there's actually a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association that was written in 1986 that has a lot of the information from the physiology and anatomy and things that I'll go through today that you can look at. So, the Last Supper, you see here, we don't exactly know. There's some controversy actually to when Jesus was born and when he died, but because the calendar has changed some. But you see here, we'll go with Thursday, April 6th, 30 AD, and then the crucifixion would have been Friday, April 7th, 30 AD. And you see here in Luke 22:44, it says, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground." Now, when I read that as a young man, I used to think, well, that just sweat. You've seen people sweat, and these just real thick drops of sweat, a lot of salt in it. Blood, if you've seen people bleed, if they're bleeding a lot, they cut their scalp and they're just dripping blood on the floor, those drops of blood can sometimes be very thick and heavy. And I always thought that's what that meant. But there's actually a medical condition called hematidrosis. I didn't know that as a child, but as I got older, I realized that. And the physician Luke records this. And remember, in Luke actually was a physician, so his writings are pretty accurate and pretty descriptive. And he describes sweat became like blood. And it turns out that this is a true condition. It's associated with great mental anguish. It's a rare condition, but a known physical entity, and a small amount of blood loss. So basically, you're not going to bleed to death from this. Jesus didn't lose a lot of blood from this, but he was in so much mental anguish, he had a little bit of blood loss in those sweat glands, and as it came out on his brow or on his face, he would have some blood on his face. Now, what this did do is make the sin super sensitive, so that any kind of beatings or any kind of touching would sort of elevate his pain threshold, if you will. So it sort of set him up for pain. So after this, the first Jewish trial, we see maybe between 1 a.m. and daybreak, somewhere in that, when he was captured in the Garden of Gethsemane. Caiaphas and the political Sanhedrin conducted this trial. They found him guilty of blasphemy, blindfolded him, spat on Jesus, and struck him in the face with their fist. So again, you're starting to see a scenario here where we're building the case for trauma, and we're going to start sort of low and elevate as we get to the cross. So great mental anguish, some blood loss, sin, super sensitivity. Now he's being beaten in the face. Remember, this is happening at night, so probably not a lot of sleep, probably tied up. So again, all these things are physical drains on his body. Then we see the second Jewish trial soon after daybreak by the religious Sanhedrin, and he was found guilty there as well. Then the Roman trials took place, and you see permission for execution had to come from the Romans. The Jews could not crucify anybody. They were under Roman law or rule, so that had to come from the Romans, and that's why they had to go to Pontius Pilate to get permission. And you see that, you know the story. Pilate found no charges, sent him to Herod. He found no charges, and then Pilate handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. So let's go through a walk now from... if I can get this to change. There we go. Let's go through a walk, what Jesus went through from the night in the garden, the Last Supper, all the way through to the next morning. So you see here, I don't know if you probably can't see it too good from back there, but I'll just walk you through it. This is Jerusalem. This is the city here. And you can see the upper room. Who really knows exactly where that was, but it's sort of depicted here, I think, in the southern part of the city. Jesus walks out the gate, down through the Kidron Valley, and up to the Garden of Gethsemane. Comes back. He's captured here, comes back in, has the first trial here, then sent to the temple for the second trial. Right over in here, he's sent to Pilate, back to Herod, back to Pilate, and then eventually outside the gate. So what's significant about all that is that's about 2.5 miles. So remember, mental anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane, a little bit of blood loss, then he's captured, then he's beaten, probably up most of the night, probably not a lot of food or water. Dehydration's probably starting to set in. He's walking 2.5 miles through all this process. So now when he's ready for the flogging, he's already gone through a lot of physical anguish, if you will, or stress on his body. Not to say that all the disciples left him, so any kind of emotional stability he had or support, that was all gone. The disciples left him all alone. So, what was the health of Jesus? Well, we read in the Bible that he walked all over Galilee and all over the country. So, as far as we know, about 30 years or so, he was very healthy. He got around and did not seem to have any health issues. From 9 p.m. through 9 a.m., he suffered great emotional stress. He had a sleepless night, abandoned by his disciples, beating after the first trial, and then walked more than 2.5 miles. So now let's get into the flogging. This is not depicted, again, in church plays and things that we see. It is really not the way it was. What we're going to go through now is really the way the Romans did it. And what they would do is tie you to a pole or a beating pole, and it could be tall, it could be short. You see here depicted in this one, it's sort of tall, to where the arms are stretched out, the back muscles are stretched out, which makes them very taut. And then 2 Roman soldiers, it could be 1, and the Roman soldier would switch sides, but a lot of times it was 2, and you see here it's depicted as 2, and they would stand on each side, and then they would take their flagrum and fling it and strike the back. Well, this was not just a leather whip that's depicted a lot of times. These strips of leather actually had pieces of bone and or metal balls in them, that when it struck the back, the metal balls would cause contusions and bruises and damage the tissue, and then the bone would actually rip into the tissue, and they could use metal as well. And they would take turns. One would strike, the other would strike, and you get a pattern of force down on each side, sort of as depicted here. And this is sort of what the flagrum looks like. You can see here, this one has metal balls on the end of it. Closer up look of the metal balls, as again, some of them have bone. Some of them have little metal strips like this that eat into the flesh. And so the whole idea is for this to actually rip flesh out and tear flesh and weaken the individual and cause blood loss. So the whole idea of the scourging or the flogging was to weaken the patient or weaken the victim before they ever went to the cross. They want, and in the Bible it says 39 times. That was Jewish law, not to go over 39, for the reason being, if you went over that or much over that, a lot of these people would die just from the scourging. And we have reason to believe with some of the words that were used and some of the descriptions that Jesus' flogging seemed to be more severe than usual, and that probably this blood loss that I'm going to show you in a minute probably led to his somewhat quick death on the cross, only about 6 hours or so. Typically people would survive on the cross anywhere from about 3 hours to 3 days. Jesus survived about 6 hours, and it was probably, as we go through the physiology here and I show you this, it was probably because of the flogging being so severe, and the blood loss is what weakened him so much. It's why he died in that time period. So now, I'm going to show you a 10-minute clip from the Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's movie. And typically, Hollywood sort of over-sensationalizes everything and doesn't always get it right. But I think based on Roman history and the way people were beat, I think now what you will see is a very accurate description, maybe not exactly what Jesus went through, but probably pretty close. It's very difficult to watch. It's very difficult for me to watch as a seasoned trauma surgeon. I can see things that doesn't bother me at all, that most people would take very offensive, just seeing the human body look that way. But even with 20 years of experience, it's hard for me to watch this. So I apologize, but again, for you to understand and for us to know what Jesus went through, we have to make this journey. So again, I do want you to pay particular attention to, there's reports, again, this is not the Bible. This is history. This is Roman history. There's reports of people through these kind of beatings, through the ripping of the flesh and the tearing of the flesh, you could actually see organs inside. You can actually see lung or kidneys. This would really destroy the body and rip flesh off. So these beatings were very, very brutal. And the Romans that did this, they were experts at it. Again, I'll show you a slide in a minute. They didn't invent it, but they certainly did perfect it. And sometimes they would have teams of 5. There would be 2 gentlemen actually striking the victim. There would even be a 3rd gentleman standing back to make sure that both of them did it right and they weren't getting tired, and that they inflicted, maximum pain. So these were very well organized squads that actually did the flogging. So Joe, if you could, please go ahead and roll the sequence. So I think you can see that, that's hard to watch, but if you notice some of those sections where ribs were showing, tissue was ripped away. If you notice there at when they drug Jesus off, the blood on the ground, we're going to talk a little bit about now how much blood he would have lost there. So his health after the flogging, he was probably going into what's called hypovolemic shock. So what does that mean? Well, hypo meaning below or low, and volume, your blood volume. So you can see he was losing blood there. He was on the ground, and when that happens, that's called hypovolemic shock. There's other kinds of shock, but that's the kind that we're going to talk about today. What happens with that is he gets a fast heart rate and a low blood pressure. So it's just like in your house. If you have a water main break and your house doesn't get enough water, there's some water left in the pipes, and you turn on the faucet, you get some water coming out, and it gets slower and slower and slower till it goes away. That's sort of like when your blood vessels are ruptured and blood comes out, you just don't have a lot of volume in your system, so the heart beats faster to pump whatever volume is left around. When that happens, obviously, if you're not pumping a good pressure of blood to your kidneys, they're just pumps. They're just filters. So you make no urine. And then your brain tells you, well, I need volume. And so you have this incredible thirst. That's why you get thirsty. You have a craving. You've got to get water in. You've got to get the volume in to try and stabilize things. So that's all hypovolemic shock. And Jesus was going into that right there while he was being beaten. That leads to another term you might not be familiar with called metabolic acidosis. And what that means is we're making acids as we sit here now in church. We're all making acids. Our cells are working and they're making acid. Just like a car puts off fumes when it's going down the road and it's burning fuel, we're burning fuel and we're making acids. Well, all that blood circulating around helps us wash out those acids and helps us either make urine and get rid of it through our kidneys, or we blow it off when we exhale. So that's starting to build up in Jesus' body, and he's getting metabolic acidosis. And this just shows you sort of what that looks like, what I just explained. You've got the heart right in the middle, and then blood comes out of the heart. It's in red here. It goes to the liver, the muscles, the kidneys, the lungs, the brain, and then it comes, after it goes to those organs, it comes back and it's pumped around again. And again, if there's just no fluid, if there's no blood in that system, things go awry. So this is a very complicated slide, and I just want to make a very straightforward point here. This is what we teach young doctors and nurses about shock. There's 4 different classifications of hypovolemic shock. It's sort of 1 is not so bad, 4 is really, really bad. And so based on what I think, and this is again my opinion, I can't prove this, but certainly knowing about how much, just seeing thousands of patients and knowing how they bleed and what kind of lacerations they have, and knowing how bad the flogging was, I suspect that Jesus lost probably somewhere in the range of right here, class 2 shock, about 750 cc's to 1.5 liters of blood while he was going through the flogging, or at least immediately after, as all those muscles and all those wounds continued to bleed while the guards mocked him and did all those things to him and took him back to Pilate. So what that means is if he'd lost that much blood, by the time, before he ever got to the cross, as he's going back to Pilate, his heart rate would have been over 100, probably in the range of 120 or 130. His blood pressure may have been normal. His compensatory mechanisms would probably have kept his blood pressure up at least for a little while. His respiratory rate, he would have been breathing about 20 to 30 times a minute, trying to blow off those acids. And then his urine output he would still been able to make urine. And then his mental status, he would have been mildly anxious. He could have been in class 3 shock when he left there, but just to sort of be conservative, I'm pretty sure that he was at least in class 2. And then maybe even before he went to the cross, he was probably going into class 3. So we see here, Mark records, and they clothed him with purple and twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him. Hail, hail, King of the Jews. Then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So what you might not pick up there is that they put the crown of thorns on their head. I've had patients bleed to death, really in car accidents, and not be found for several hours and be in the woods or in a ditch with a severe scalp laceration. So you can lose a lot of blood from your scalp. It's a very vascular area, your face, your scalp. They took thorns, a crown of thorns, wove them together, and put that down on his head. Those probably went down through the skin, probably down to bone. And the bleeding just from that alone was significant. So that was probably another several hundred cc's of blood just from that one act alone. And you see here that they took this robe off of him and put it back on. Well, any clot that formed on his back between going from the flogging to going to Pilate, by taking these clothes on and off his back, that's going to rip the clot off and he's going to bleed more. So certainly by the time he got ready to go to the cross, he had probably gone into class 3 shock and lost close to 2 liters of blood. Now, with that being said, you remember that when he started to carry the cross and he stumbled and he fell, that shows how weak he was. That gives you an idea there that he was hypovolemic and he really was running out of energy, and probably by this time had a low blood pressure. He really couldn't sustain or mount the response and the energy needed to carry the cross. So, as I said, the crucifixion, the Persians probably were the first to use. Alexander the Great introduced the practice into Egypt and to Carthage. The Romans learned from the Carthaginians. Slow death with maximal pain. Roman citizens were actually exempt from this. This was so bad, the Roman citizens were exempt, and except maybe soldiers when they deserted. And they had to come up with a word. The pain was so bad for the crucifixion, that's where excruciating came from. It means out of the cross. So the next time you say, I'm in excruciating pain, your thoughts should go back to Jesus and the cross. Now, right here, there's a lot of debate about what kind of cross. You see in the movies, Jesus carries this big T cross. That's probably not what he carried. For one thing, it would have been too heavy. The actual middle part of the cross here, the front, the pole is called the stipes. It's several hundred pounds, and it's usually mounted, and wherever the Romans were going to carry this act out, it's usually mounted. The crossbar is called the patibulum, and that's actually about 75 to 125 pounds, just that one piece of wood by itself. And that's what usually they would strap that wood, but with ropes, or have the victim carry that to the cross, to the stipes that was already mounted in the ground. So when Jesus, they said, carry your cross, after that beating, just think, after that beating, he was asked to carry the patibulum, which you see depicted here, that was anywhere from 75 to 125 pounds. Now, I see a lot of strong men in here, and carrying that by yourself in good health with breakfast this morning, that's a real job just to do that, especially if your arms are tied to it like this where you really can't keep your balance very good. Imagine trying to do that after going through the beating that Jesus went through. There's also debate about you see the cross here, this little cross, if my pointer, little cross right here, that's called the tau cross, and then the more Latin cross that really looks more like a T. Jesus was probably, they used both back in that time, and you can find archaeologic findings with, from back in that time that have been excavated, and both crosses were used. Probably Jesus was on this cross, although nobody actually knows for sure. Now, you'll see depicted, they drove nails through his hands. Sometimes they tied your hands to the cross and your feet. Sometimes they used nails. Some people will say, well, you know, in the Bible it says that Jesus' hands were nailed to the cross. And hands, now they've done experiments, hands will not hold you up. If I put a big spike nail through my hand and hang me from across, the tissue will give and I'll fall to the floor. But you have to remember, back in those days, in the writings, the wrist was considered part of the hand. And that's where they would put the nails. And if you put a nail right through the wrist bones, it will support the weight of the victim on the cross. And you can see here, I've just depicted for you, this is what the wrist looks like. You've got the two bones at the top, the radius and the ulna, comes down to the finger bones or the phalanges, and then in between there's a bunch of little, they're not really round, but we'll just, for simplicity, we'll just call them mostly round bones that are together with ligaments. And right in there is where you could put a nail, and it would hold because of all those ligaments. Now, what's important, you see that yellow structure, if my pointer will show it right there, your yellow structure right here, that's a nerve. That's called the median nerve that runs right along, right through there. So those nails would have gone through that nerve or either been right by the nerve, and it would have caused excruciating pain. The other nerve on the side over there is the ulnar nerve, and you hit your funny bone, you hit it back here, and you dance around the room because that's the ulnar nerve, and that's just sort of from blunt trauma and just stinging it a little bit. Imagine a spike nail going through the median nerve, which would have probably led to sort of a claw hand and contraction and cramps like that. You would also heard in the Bible that no bone will be broken in his body. And you say, well, how could he go through that and not have broken bones? They drove nails through his hands. Well, the way those little bones in the wrist are positioned, it's very easy. They're all held together by ligaments. It's very easy for that spike nail go in between those bones and not break a bone. So that's very logical. This just depicts here what the hand may have looked like. You can see the nail going through. These were very long spike nails, probably about a half-inch head on it, that would support the weight of the body. The feet the same way. There's been designs of cross changes, you know, where sometimes they put a little wedge on the base of the cross to put the feet on. Probably back at the time of Jesus' time, that wedge probably came out after his crucifixion, so his feet were probably nailed right to the cross. Again, nails could very easily go between the bones in the feet without breaking any bones. Very logical, the way they could nail him to the cross. Again, supporting the description in the Bible. Whoops, let's go back. So now, let's sort of talk about respirations on the cross. Why do you die on the cross? You really don't lose a lot of blood from being nailed to the cross. There's not a lot of, all the blood loss was from the flogging. You don't hit major blood vessels when you nail people to the cross. Obviously, you're going to get a lot of pain. So why did Jesus die? Well, people that were put on the cross would die from asphyxiation. They could not breathe. So right now, this just shows you this depiction here, you know, how the chest wall moves in and out. As it moves out, it's like a bellow. My lungs, my diaphragm comes down, my ribs come out, and then when I exhale, all that comes back in, and I'm moving air in and out, really like a bellows. That's how I breathe. And the way I do that is you see the ribs here. In between each rib is muscles, and they're all contracting. I've got a lot of muscles on those ribs, some muscles that come in from my, up around my neck area, and then obviously the diaphragm. And they all work in concert to where now when I take a breath, my rib cage expands and air rushes in. So let's see what would happen on the cross. So now if I take a breath, I have to work to take a breath. I expel energy, my muscles contract, and I'm taking a breath. So when I exhale, I just relax. I don't have to do any work. It's called passive. That's passive breathing. In other words, I just relax, and the elasticity of my chest goes back to where it was, and I exhale. On the cross, with your arms, you can see depicted there, Jesus' arms, you know, nailed up here, and the weight of his body pulling his arms down. He's in a constant inhalation mode. So really, for him to exhale, he has to pull up. He has to pull with those spike nails, pull his arms up and push with his feet, his body up, so that he can actually exhale. So exhaling becomes work. Exhaling becomes the active part of motion, okay? It's just reversed. And you can imagine, if you're in pain, you're exhausted, every time I want to take a deep breath, I could guppy breathe without doing that, just with my diaphragm, but that won't keep me alive. To really take a deep breath, I've got to pull up. So now I have to pull on spike nails through my hands with the weight of my body, push up with my feet with a spike nail, and if that wasn't enough, I have to drag my raw back up and down the splinters of that wood so that I can exhale, and then I go back into this inhalation mode where my chest is pulled apart again. So very difficult, and that's why people asphyxiated on the cross. They finally just wore out. So, but when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, again being consistent with the prophecy of the Bible that no bone shall be broken. They broke the other gentleman's legs. And the reason they did that is, remember, if your legs are broken below the knee and I can't push up, well, I can't assist in breathing, and I just can't get enough force with my arms to do it by myself. It takes the arms and the legs, so they would just quit breathing quicker. So that's why they broke their legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. So let's talk about that just for a second. They were making sure that Jesus was dead because, remember, if the Roman soldiers ever let anybody off the cross that was alive, they might end up with the same fate. It was that the soldiers were not going to be punished because they let someone survive the cross. And so here's what the depiction looks like of the lungs. You see the right lung, the left lung, and the heart sets in the middle. So there's a cavity for the right lung and a cavity for the left lung. Each cavity can hold some fluid, and you might have heard, one of your loved ones went to the hospital and they had a pleural effusion or some fluid on the lungs, or that's a lot of times what they're talking about. In that chest cavity, there's some fluid there, and we can give you some medicines and do some things and help get rid of that fluid. And with Jesus being in shock and going through the things that he did, it's very plausible that he had some fluid inside his chest cavity. So now it says that the spear went through his side. So it's thought, obviously nobody knows, but based on the depictions and the spears and things and the way Roman soldiers were taught to make sure people were dead, you can see the spear or sword probably went through his right side, through this chest cavity here, which would have drained some water, and then into his heart and ruptured his heart, and then blood would have come out, making absolutely sure that he was dead. So some people have said, well, that's controversial. The Bible says that water or blood and water came out first, so that shows that that's not correct. That shows that, the Bible is not true. Well, you have to remember, back in those days when the writers would write, they wrote based on what was the most significant fluid. That's the one that they would list first. And most people thought blood was more significant than water, so blood was listed first. So it's very explainable once you realize how the writings took place. And so probably what happened when they did stab his side, water came out from the chest, probably came out first, and then blood followed as the spear went into the heart. So what would Jesus, as we sort of finish up here, what would Jesus have looked like if he had survived the crucifixion? Well, he would not be able to walk with spike nails through his feet. His arms would probably have been dislocated from hanging on the cross and all the things that he'd gone through. He would have massive open wounds on his back. You saw some of those wounds, probably maybe organs exposed, probably ribs exposed. The amount of functionability he would have had would have been very, very limited. Probably infection would have set in, and then certainly if he got by all that, remember, the Romans knew how to kill people. They were experts. These death squads were experts in pain and killing people. He would have had to survive a spear wound to his chest, which is almost unheard of. So, in the book by Lee Strobel, there's a chapter in there by this Dr. Alexander, or not the whole chapter is by this doctor, but commented in here, Metherell. And he says, I think this sums it up. A person in that kind of pathetic condition would never have inspired his disciples to go out and proclaim that he's the Lord of life who had triumphed over the grave. So I want to switch a little bit now just to really bring that home. For those that may not believe, just think about this. From the science that I've shown you today and from the walk that we've done, it's not plausible and it's not logical to think that Jesus was not dead when he went into the cross. When he went into the tomb. It's just, based on everything we know, that's just not a feasible consideration. So him being dead going into the cross, going into the wound, into the tomb, what happened then was that he rose from the grave. And if you don't believe that, then think about this. This quote here I thought really brought it home to me. Let's say someone did steal Jesus' body. Let's say the disciples stole it. Let's say some friends of the disciples stole it. Jesus would have been in such a pathetic condition, nobody would have worshiped him. Nobody would have followed him. Nobody would have certainly said, you're the King of Kings, you're the Messiah, you're the one that's going to save the world. That's not very plausible either. And then when you realize these 12 disciples not only stated that and said, we saw him, we know that he came out of the grave, we know he was dead when he went into the grave, and we're going to follow him. They actually, you might say for a year or two or for a few church services, we're going to keep this story going. But these guys did it the rest of their life. They lived hard lives. They were abused. One of them was skinned alive. Peter was crucified upside down. And it goes on and on and on. They gave their whole life away saying that Jesus was the Son of God and that he was alive and came out of that tomb and that we saw him. And they went to their grave. They went to their grave in a very hard way. I think only one of them, I don't want to get too far out on a limb here, I'm going from memory, but I think only one of them died from natural causes. So how would these men go to their grave and suffer promoting a lie? That's just not feasible either. And so that's, when I put all this together, I cannot settle that. I have to, in my heart, know that Jesus was the Son of God and that he rose from the grave. So in conclusion, Jesus died on the cross. He rose from the grave. Therefore we shall live. Thank you very much.